Sir, my mommy disappeared after her blind date. One single dad braved the snow to find her. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. The snow had been falling for 3 hours straight by the time Colton Reeves pulled into the pharmacy parking lot, and the kind of cold that settled into your bones had taken over the entire town. The kind that made you think twice about leaving your truck even for 5 minutes. He sat there for a second with the engine still running, watching the snowflakes swirl under the streetlights like some kind of winter snow globe, and his construction jacket was still dusted with dried cement from the job site, because when you're a single dad working overtime to make Christmas happen, you don't always have time to change before picking up cold medicine for your 6-year-old who's been coughing all week. Willa sat in the passenger seat bundled up in her purple coat with a fake fur hood, clutching her little stuffed elephant that she'd named Peanut for reasons Colton still didn't understand, and she looked up at him with those big brown eyes that were exactly like her mother's. "Daddy, can I get the grape medicine instead of the cherry kind? The cherry one tastes like sad strawberries." And Colton had to bite back a smile because sad strawberries was the most Willa thing she'd ever said, and he nodded and promised grape medicine only. Cross his heart. They walked into the pharmacy together with Willa's small hand tucked into his rough, work-worn one, and the warm air inside hit them like a wall after the biting cold outside, and Christmas music played softly over the speakers while a tired-looking clerk rang up the last few customers of the night. Colton grabbed the medicine and a box of tissues, because you could never have too many during cold season, and Willa sat on the little bench by the front window, swinging her legs and humming along to Jingle Bells while she waited. And for a moment, everything felt normal and safe, and exactly like it should. But then they stepped back outside into the snow, and that feeling shattered into 1,000 pieces because Willa stopped walking so suddenly that Colton almost stumbled. And she was pointing toward the vending machines near the edge of the parking lot with her mitten-covered hand, and her voice came out small and worried. "Daddy, why is that little girl all alone out here?" And Colton followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop, because sitting on the cold concrete next to the humming Coke machine was a child, maybe 5 years old, wearing a thin pink coat that wasn't nearly warm enough for this weather and mismatched mittens and boots that were covered in snow. The girl was crying, not the loud dramatic kind of crying, but the quiet kind that meant she'd been at it for a while and had run out of energy, and she had her arms wrapped around a small backpack, like it was the only thing keeping her grounded to the earth. Colton's protective instincts kicked in so hard and fast, it almost knocked the wind out of him, because this was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. No child should be outside alone in a snowstorm when it was 20 degrees and getting colder by the minute. He walked over slowly and crouched down to her level, keeping his movements gentle and his voice soft, because the last thing he wanted to do was scare her more than she already was. "Hey there, sweetheart. Are you okay? Where are your grown-ups?" The little girl looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes and a face blotchy from crying, and she looked from Colton to Willa like she was trying to decide if they were safe, and then her bottom lip trembled and she whispered in this tiny broken voice that Colton would hear in his nightmares for weeks. "Sir, my mommy disappeared after her blind date." And the way she said it, like she was confessing something she didn't fully understand, made Colton's chest tighten so hard he had to take a breath before he could respond. Willa immediately sat down on the cold concrete next to the girl without being asked, and she held out Peanut the elephant like it was the most valuable thing in the world. "You can hold him if you want. He makes me feel better when I'm scared." The little girl took the stuffed animal with shaking hands and clutched it to her chest, and Colton stayed crouched there in the snow trying to process what he'd just heard, because disappeared was a word no child should have to use about their mother. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked gently, and the girl whispered June so quietly he almost didn't hear it over the wind. "Okay, June, I'm Colton, and this is my daughter Willa, and we're going to help you, but I need you to tell me what happened. Can you do that?" June nodded and started talking in that fragmented way little kids do when they're scared and exhausted, her words coming out in pieces between shivers. "Mommy had a date. She said it was at the diner down the street, the one with the blue sign, and she told me to stay inside with my coloring book for just 10 minutes. She wiped her nose with her mitten. But the man never came, And Mommy went outside to make a phone call, and then she didn't come back. And the people at the diner said they were closing because of the snow, and I got scared, so I went to look for her, but I couldn't find her anywhere. Colton felt something cold and sharp settle in his gut that had nothing to do with the weather, because he'd lost his wife 4 years ago to cancer, and he remembered exactly what it felt like to have someone disappear from your life. And the thought of this little girl going through anything even close to that made him want to fix it right now immediately. Did your mommy say anything else? Did she mention the person she was meeting? June shook her head. She just said it was a blind date, and she was nervous, and I told her she looked pretty and she smiled at me, and then she left and now she's gone. Willis squeezed June's hand and said with all the confidence of a 6-year-old who believed her daddy could fix anything, "My daddy always helps people. He built a whole house once, and he fixes things that are broken, so he can help find your mommy too." And Colton looked at his daughter, and then at June, who was staring at him with these desperate, hopeful eyes. And he knew there was absolutely no way he was walking away from this. No way he was leaving this child out in the cold while her mother was missing somewhere in a snowstorm. He stood up and held out both his hands, one for Willa and one for June. "Come on, let's get you warmed up first, and then we're going to find your mom. I promise." They went back into the pharmacy, and the clerk looked alarmed when she saw June's condition, immediately grabbing one of those emergency blankets from behind the counter and wrapping it around the shivering little girl. Colton explained the situation in low tones while Willa sat with June and shared a granola bar from her coat pocket, and the clerk said she'd call the police. But it might take a while because half the force was dealing with accident calls from the storm. Colton looked down at June, who was watching him with this mixture of fear and trust that absolutely wrecked him, and he knelt down again and spoke directly to her in that steady voice he used when Willa had nightmares. "June, I know you're scared, and I know this feels really bad right now, but I promise you're not alone anymore. We're going to help you find your mom, and we're not going to stop until we do, okay?" June nodded and then did something that made Willa beam with pride. She reached out and took both their hands and squeezed tight. The three of them stepped back out into the night together, the pharmacy lights glowing warm behind them as they headed toward the dark, snowy street. And Colton adjusted June's blanket and scanned the road ahead with the same determination he brought to every job site, every project, every promise he'd ever made. The snow was falling heavier now, thick flakes that blurred the street lights and muffled every sound. And somewhere out there in the cold, a mother was missing and a little girl needed her back. Colton looked down at Willa on his left and June on his right, both holding his hands tight. And he thought about how sometimes life put you exactly where you needed to be even when you didn't understand why. And he started walking toward the diner with the blue sign, toward answers, toward whatever came next, because the only thing that mattered right now was bringing June's mother home. The walk to the diner felt like it took forever, even though it was only 3 blocks. And the snow was coming down so thick now that Colton could barely see the streetlights more than 20 feet ahead. And the wind had picked up enough that he had to keep June's blanket tucked tight around her shoulders to keep it from blowing away. Willa walked close to his side without complaining once, even though he knew her feet had to be freezing in those light-up sneakers she'd insisted on wearing. And June hadn't said a word since they left the pharmacy, just kept her eyes fixed on the sidewalk like she was afraid if she looked up, her mom might disappear all over again. The diner sat on the corner with a faded blue sign that read Rosie's in cursive letters, and most of the lights were off except for one dim bulb near the back, and Colton could see someone inside moving around with a mop and bucket, clearly closing up for the night. He knocked on the glass door hard enough to be heard over the wind, and the worker, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, with her hair pulled back in a ponytail, looked up startled, and then saw the 2 shivering kids and immediately unlocked the door. "We're closed because of the storm, but good Lord, get those babies inside before they freeze," she said, ushering them in, and the warmth hit them like a blessing, and the smell of old coffee and pie filled the air, and there were paper snowflakes taped to the windows and a tiny artificial tree on the counter blinking with colored lights. June broke away from Colton the second she was inside and ran straight to a booth near the window, pressing her small hands against the worn vinyl seat like she was trying to feel her mother's presence there. "She sat right here," June whispered and her voice cracked. This is where she waited. The worker looked at Colton with concern, and he explained quickly. Told her they were looking for a woman named Maren Ellis, who'd come here for a blind date earlier tonight and never made it home. And the worker's face shifted from confusion to recognition, and then to something that looked a lot like guilt. Oh, honey, yes, I remember her. She waited in that exact booth for almost 20 minutes, kept checking her phone, and looking at the door like she was expecting someone who never showed. Colton felt his jaw tighten because he'd already started piecing together a picture of a woman who'd been nervous and alone, and stood up on what was probably already a hard thing to do. Did you see her leave? Did she say anything? The worker nodded slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. She got a phone call, I think, and she stepped outside to take it, said she'd be right back, but she never came back in, and we got the call to close early, maybe 15 minutes later, because the roads were getting bad, and I just figured she'd already left. June made this small wounded sound, and Willa immediately climbed into the booth next to her and wrapped her arms around her. And Colton had never been more proud of his daughter than he was right in that moment. He asked the worker if she'd seen which direction Maren went, or if anyone else had been around, but she shook her head apologetically, said it had been snowing too hard to see much of anything through the windows. They thanked her and headed back out into the storm, and June looked smaller somehow, more fragile, and Colton lifted her up onto his hip, even though his arms were already tired from work, because there was no way he was making her walk through this. They'd only made it half a block when headlights cut through the snow, and a big orange snowplow rumbled toward them, moving slow and steady, pushing white drifts to the side of the road. The plow slowed and then stopped completely, and an older man with a weathered face and a knit cap leaned out the window, his breath fogging in the cold air. You folks got car trouble? Shouldn't be out walking in this mess. Colton was about to explain when the man's eyes landed on June, and his expression changed, softened into something like recognition. Wait a minute, I saw you earlier, didn't I? You were with your mama at the diner. June's head snapped up so fast Colton almost lost his grip on her, and she stared at the snowplow driver with desperate hope. You saw my mommy? Where did she go? The old man, who introduced himself as Mr. Henson, pulled his plow fully to the side and climbed down, moving carefully on the icy road. I did see her, sweetheart, but I gotta be honest, something about it didn't sit right with me even then. He explained that he'd been making his rounds clearing the main roads when he saw a woman matching Maren's description, talking to a man beside a dark-colored sedan parked near the diner, and she looked confused and hesitant. And Mr. Henson had slowed down because something in his gut told him to pay attention. I couldn't hear most of what they were saying over the plow engine, but I heard her say real clear, "You're not the person from the app," and the guy showed her something on his phone, and whatever it was made her stop arguing. Colton felt ice slide down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Did she get in the car willingly? Did he force her? Mr. Henson shook his head firmly. No force, but she looked worried, conflicted maybe, like she didn't want to go but felt like she had to. And then she got in the passenger seat and they drove off toward the old residential roads, the ones that lead out past the Henderson place. He gave them directions, told them to be careful, and climbed back into his plow, and Colton stood there holding June while his mind raced through possibilities. June was trembling, and it wasn't just from the cold anymore. Why would Mommy get into a stranger's car? She always tells me never to do that. She says it's the most important rule. And Colton adjusted his grip on her and tried to find words that would make sense to a 5-year-old when he barely understood it himself. Sometimes grown-ups get scared too, and maybe she thought this person knew something important, something about you or something that made her feel like she didn't have a choice. But we're gonna find out, okay? Willa pulled a tiny paper star from her pocket, one she'd folded during craft time at school, and she pressed it into June's mitten-covered hand. This is for good luck, and also because you're brave like a star, and stars don't give up even when it's dark. June clutched that paper star like it was made of actual magic, and they kept walking, following Mr. Henson's directions down streets that got quieter and older. Houses that had been around since before Colton was born, most of them dark except for the occasional porch light glowing yellow against the white snow. That's when Colton spotted them, tire tracks cutting fresh through the accumulating snow, leading down a narrow lane lined with bare trees, And at the end of the street, there was a mailbox half buried in a drift. And even from a distance, Colton could make out the letters painted on the side. ELLIS. June saw it at the same exact moment and gasped. That's Mommy's name. That's our last name. And Colton's heart started pounding because this wasn't random anymore. This was connected to something deeper, something from Marin's past. They followed the tire tracks to a small house at the end of the lane, older and a little run down but not abandoned, with one dim light glowing from a front window and smoke coming from the chimney. Colton set June down carefully and told both girls to stay behind him, and he moved closer to the porch, boots crunching in the snow. And through the frosted window he could see movement inside, shadows shifting, and then he saw her. A woman sitting on a worn couch, her posture tense but not restrained, and a man pacing in front of her, his hands moving like he was trying to explain something, and the woman was speaking softly, her voice muffled by the glass. And Colton realized with a jolt of relief and confusion that this wasn't a kidnapping. This was something else entirely. The man wasn't threatening her. He was upset, maybe even crying. And the woman, who had to be Marin based on June's description, was trying to calm him down. Colton's construction site instincts kicked in, the same ones he used when a new guy panicked 40 feet up on scaffolding, and he recognized the signs of someone spiraling, someone who needed help, not handcuffs. He knocked on the door, firm but not aggressive, and the reaction inside was immediate. The man's head whipped toward the sound, and his eyes went wide with fear, and Marin stood up quickly, her hands raised in a calming gesture, and she moved toward the door but stopped, turning back to the man and saying something Colton couldn't hear. The door opened a crack, and Marin's face appeared, pale and exhausted and streaked with tears, and she looked at Colton with this mixture of relief and panic. Please, you need to understand, he's not dangerous. He's my brother. He's sick, and he thought I was in trouble, and I came with him to keep him from doing something worse. And before Colton could respond, June's small voice cut through the night air like a knife. Mommy? Marin's eyes went huge, and she shoved the door open and dropped to her knees in the snow. And June ran to her so fast she almost slipped. And mother and daughter collided in a hug so tight Colton had to look away because it felt too private, too sacred. I'm okay, baby. I'm okay. I promise. Marin kept repeating, and June was sobbing into her mother's shoulder. And inside the house, the man, Aaron, Marin's brother, stood frozen watching them, and the look on his face was pure devastation. Colton stepped carefully into the doorway, keeping his voice low and steady. Nobody's calling the cops, not yet, but your sister and her daughter need to go home, and you need help, real help, the kind that doesn't come from a jail cell. Aaron slumped into a chair and put his head in his hands, and Marin whispered, "Thank you," over and over while holding June like she'd never let go again. The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later without sirens or flashing lights. Just a quiet presence that pulled up to the old house like it had done this 100 times before. And the paramedics who stepped out weren't treating this like a crime scene, but like what it actually was, a mental health crisis that had spiraled out of control. Aaron sat on the porch steps with a blanket around his shoulders, looking absolutely exhausted. And Marin sat beside him, holding his hand while June stayed close to Colton and Willa, watching everything with wide, uncertain eyes. I didn't mean to scare you, Aaron said to his sister, and his voice was hoarse from crying. I saw your profile on that dating app when I was scrolling through, and I just panicked, thought someone was going to hurt you, thought I needed to protect you like I couldn't protect you when we were kids. Marin squeezed his hand tighter. I know, and I'm not angry. But you can't keep doing this. You need real help, the kind I can't give you by myself. Aaron nodded and let the paramedics guide him toward the ambulance. And before he climbed inside, he looked at June and said, I'm sorry I scared you, sweetheart. Your mom is the best person I know, and you're lucky to have her. June didn't say anything, but she nodded, and Marin watched the ambulance pull away with tears streaming down her face. And Colton recognized that specific kind of sadness. The kind that came from loving someone who was hurting and not being able to fix them. He walked over and without asking wrapped his construction jacket around Marin's shoulders because she'd left hers somewhere in the chaos and the temperature had dropped even further. The jacket was way too big on her, sleeves hanging past her hands, and it smelled like sawdust and coffee. And Willa giggled quietly, which broke the tension just enough that Marin managed a small smile. "Thank you," Marin said, and it came out as barely more than a whisper. "For finding me, for bringing June, for not making this worse than it already was." Colton shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. Any decent person would have done the same thing." But Marin looked at him with those tired red-rimmed eyes and said, "No, they really wouldn't have. Most people would have called the cops first and asked questions later, but you saw what this actually was." Colton suggested they go back to the diner, said something about how the place where everything started felt like the right place to catch their breath, and Marin agreed because June needed somewhere warm and she needed a minute to process everything that had just happened. They walked back through the streets together, and the snow had finally started to let up, falling in gentle, lazy flakes instead of the heavy curtain it had been earlier, and the town looked softer somehow, quieter, like it was tucking itself in for the night. Rosie's diner had reopened for the late-night crowd, the people who worked graveyard shifts or couldn't sleep or just needed somewhere warm to exist for a while, and the worker from earlier lit up when she saw them come through the door. "Oh, thank God, I've been worried sick, wondering if you found her." She brought hot chocolate for the girls without being asked and coffee for the adults. And they settled into the same booth where Moraine had waited for a date that never came, except this time she wasn't alone. Colton and Willa sat on one side, Marin and June on the other, and for a few minutes nobody said much of anything, just wrapped their hands around warm mugs and let the feeling come back to their frozen fingers. June was pressed against her mother's side, like she was afraid Maureen might vanish again if she let go, and Willa kept stealing glances at them with this satisfied look like she'd personally solved the whole mystery. Eventually Maureen started talking, not because anyone asked, but because she needed to say it out loud. "I haven't been on a date in 5 years, not since June's dad left when she was just a baby. And I told myself it was because I was busy, or because she needed me more than I needed romance. But the truth is, I was terrified." She stared into her coffee cup. "Terrified of disappointing her. Terrified of letting someone in just to have them leave again. Terrified that maybe I wasn't worth staying for in the first place." She explained how she'd walked into this exact diner already convinced it was a mistake, how when the date never showed up, she'd felt foolish and relieved at the same time, and how seeing her brother outside had felt like the universe confirming that she wasn't supposed to try. "I thought maybe this was a sign that I should just stop pretending I could have anything more than what I already have." Colton listened without interrupting, his calloused hands steady around his mug. And when she finally looked up at him, he said something that made her chest tighten. "I lost my wife 4 years ago to cancer, and for the longest time I thought that was it for me. Thought I'd used up my one chance at love, and everything after that was just going through the motions for Willa's sake." He glanced at his daughter, who was sharing her hot chocolate with June. "But watching you with June tonight, seeing how hard you fought to protect your brother even when he was the one scaring you, that's not someone who isn't worth staying for. That's someone who's so worth it, she doesn't even see it." The conversation hung there between them, honest and raw and real, and the diner's Christmas music played softly in the background while the snow continued falling gentle outside the windows. June, who'd been quietly listening to the grown-ups talk, suddenly piped up with the kind of logic only a 5-year-old could deliver. "Can we go on a not blind date next time? So nobody disappears and we know who we're meeting, and also so it's not scary?" Willa nodded enthusiastically and added her own requirement. "And we should eat waffles because Daddy only buys waffles when he really likes someone. He got waffles for Miss Rachel at the school fundraiser, and then he was all weird and smiley for a week." Colton's face went bright red, and Marin laughed for the first time that night, a real genuine laugh that made her whole face light up, and suddenly the weight of everything that had happened lifted just enough that breathing felt easier. They finished their drinks and bundled back up to face the cold, and when they stepped outside, the snow had slowed to almost nothing, just a few flakes drifting lazy through the glow of the streetlights. Marin pulled Colton's jacket tighter around herself and looked up at him. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did tonight. You didn't have to help us, but you did anyway. And I think you might have saved more than just me." Colton's voice was gentle when he answered. "No child should ever have to wait for a mother who doesn't come back, and no mother should feel alone in the dark, It's that simple. June reached for Willa's hand, and the two girls stood there in the snow smiling at each other like they'd known each other forever instead of just a few hours. And Willa whispered something that made June giggle. Colton watched them and then gathered up the courage to ask the question that had been building in his chest since they sat down in that booth. If it's not too soon, and if you're interested, could we maybe do this again? All of us. A real breakfast, not a blind date, just people who already know they like each other's company? Marin looked down at June, who was nodding so hard her whole body moved. And when she looked back up at Colton, her smile was soft and hopeful and just a little bit scared in the best possible way. I'd really like that. And I think June would too. Willa cheered quietly and did a little victory dance that involved a lot of arm waving, and Colton felt something warm spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. They walked together toward the parking lot where Colton's truck waited, and Marin's car was still parked near the diner from hours ago. And when June started to shiver, Colton lifted her up without thinking twice about it, carried her so her feet wouldn't get any colder. Marin took Willa's hand, and the four of them moved through the gentle snowfall like they'd been doing this forever. And above them, the clouds were starting to break apart, showing tiny glimpses of stars. Some nights bring fear and others bring storms, but some nights bring people together who were meant to find each other. Not because they went looking for love, but because kindness refused to let anyone stay lost in the snow. A single dad and a missing mother, once complete strangers, now walking side by side through a small town that had gone quiet for the night. Not as a family yet, but as people who'd finally stopped walking alone, who'd found each other in the cold and decided that maybe the warmth was worth trying for. Colton set June down gently by her mother's car, and Willa hugged her goodbye, like they were old friends, and Maureen promised to call tomorrow about that not blind breakfast date. And as they drove away in opposite directions, the snow finally stopped completely, and the sky cleared enough that the stars came out in full, bright and steady and sure. Sometimes the best beginnings come from the worst nights, sometimes children see what adults miss, and sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to stop and help to change everything. If this story reminded you that kindness still exists, that single parents are heroes every single day, and that family can be found in the most unexpected places, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thanks for being here with us.